Period 6 is looking at the era really from the end of the US Civil War to the turn of the 20th century. And despite the years that are listed here for Chapter 16, 1870 to 1890, it's probably best to think of America's Gilded Age as being from 1865 to 1898, or that sort of second half of the 19th century, really corresponding to the years of Period 6. Before we get started, I want to be clear that the Gilded Age was a term coined by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner in their book, The Gilded Age, as a kind of derisive term for this era of the late 1800s, because gilded means to cover something in a very thin layer of gold, and that suggests a surface, or this sort of gold surface, covers a core that has little or no real value. And likewise, American society in the late 1800s was kind of gilded in that sense. You had, in outward appearances, a large booming economy that portrays an image of wealth and power, but on the inside, the core of America was wrapped by rampant political corruption, class divisions, and poverty and racism. So the term that we use for this era is actually rather useful in understanding the basic society that we're looking at. So, essential question one is, what factors combined to make the United States a mature industrial society after the Civil War? So, the United States experienced rapid industrialization after the Civil War, and in fact, as we saw in Period 5, this rapid industrialization really began during the war as the North was producing and industry was booming in order to supply Union troops. This rapid industrialization, starting during the Civil War and lasting through the late 1800s, really didn't affect the South, as we saw, as they remain a largely agrarian society based on producing cotton even after slavery is abolished. But this rapid industrialization means that by 1913, the United States produced 1/3 of the world's manufactured goods. Now, this rapid industrialization also means that many people moved to cities like New York, Chicago, etc. during this period to work in factory jobs. And that included about 25 million immigrants that entered the United States during the late 1800s. Our first big wave of immigration in the early 1800s were typically Irish and German, but after the Civil War, in this Gilded Age, we have a kind of second wave, or second major wave of immigration, and these immigrants are referred to as the new immigrants, capital N, capital I, and they hail predominantly from Southern and Eastern European countries like Poland, Russia, Greece, Italy, and so on. We'll talk more about them later because immigration tends to be a theme that the APUSH test likes to focus on pretty heavily in some cases. So we want to look in some detail at each major wave of immigration and the way the United States responds to them. So we will focus more on the new immigrants as we continue to work our way through Period 6. As a result of this rapid urbanization, or lots and lots of people migrating to cities to work in factory jobs, cities actually grew too rapidly in this period. And that led to overcrowding in, tenement buildings. And tenement buildings were like hastily constructed apartments that are also tend to be very poorly constructed, very unsanitary, very poorly ventilated. And cities tended to have very poor sanitation as well, leading to, again, overcrowding, crime, spread of disease, and so on, until these cities' infrastructure can catch up with the populations that are entering them. I also want to add here that this rapid industrialization meant the introduction in the United States of new business practices. Businesses were introducing systems of what were called scientific management, which you might also see called Taylorism. But scientific management, or Taylorism, was designed to increase factory production and decrease labor costs by looking at the most efficient ways to construct things in an industrial environment. It's essentially a very heavily, very strictly managed workplace in order to make it as productive as possible. Another thing that contributes to making the U.S. a mature industrial society in the Gilded Age are railroads, or the construction of more railroads than ever before. And you can see the comparison here on the map between 1840 and 50 years later in 1890. There are obviously a lot more railroads. And railroads created national markets for goods. In other words, rather than a business supplying a city or a state or even a region, they could supply potentially the entire country because they have an easier method to transport these goods across the U.S. So the United States tripled the number of railroad tracks they had by 1880. And also, I should add, the United States completed their first transcontinental railroad, which was, as you'll remember, chartered during the Civil War by the Republican Party, and this was completed in 1869. And keep in mind that the government heavily invested in this. They chartered the two companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, and gave them funds to help build this transcontinental railroad. So this here shows that the government was very much invested in helping the United States become more industrialized. So our first transcontinental railroad was completed in 1869. We had 5 transcontinental railroads by the 1890s. And this means that, like I've said, it makes possible national markets, which makes possible national brands of goods. Examples of national brands or brand name products that could now be sold across the United States are Ivory Soap or Quaker Oats, both products that are of course still around today. And these national brands and national marketplaces necessitated mass marketing, which is something the United States had never had before. So this is mass marketing by way of billboards, posters, advertisements in newspapers, and so on. These national markets, as a result of railroads, also make possible national chains. And by national chains, I mean stores that service the entire nation potentially. So a national chain was A&P grocery stores, Sears, Roebuck and Company, which were mail order catalogs. So you get this catalog, order whatever you wanted out of it, which they really provided just about anything, including unconstructed houses. You could order those; they could be shipped by railroad anywhere in the country, and you would have your product. And these national chains, and such as A&P or Sears, Roebuck and Company catalog, they also marketed national brands like Ivory Soap, Quaker Oats, and so on. Another really important concept to understand about the Gilded Age, or Period 6, is that ruthless business competition led to the creation of trusts and monopolies. So as businesses industrialize to manufacture their products in mass numbers, they're competing with one another, and this ruthless business competition that characterizes this period led to the creation of, again, trusts and monopolies. And there's a difference between the two, obviously, but you can sometimes use the term trust and monopoly somewhat interchangeable. But to clarify, a trust is when several different companies in a single industry, like say the oil industry or maybe the steel industry, were run by a single director or board, basically meaning that all these different companies in one industry are run by one small group of people who can determine what prices are going to be and what wages are going to be, and generally control that industry. Now, a monopoly, on the other hand, is when one company controls an entire industry. And here's where I want to focus, because we've got a couple of really perfect examples for this that will serve as great evidence on the APUSH test for you, and they also tend to be the subject of questions in the multiple choice section. So the first example of a monopoly, or one company controlling an entire industry, that I want to talk about is Andrew Carnegie's Carnegie Steel Company. Andrew Carnegie used a method called vertical integration. And you can see here a visual aid that kind of helps understand this. It's using, a hypothetical meat company, which, Carnegie was steel, but nonetheless, the process is basically the same. It means that a company controls every step of the production of a good. So they control the sources, production, and even distribution of a product. Later on, Carnegie Steel Company will become part of a larger steel company called J.P. Morgan's U.S. Steel, which might serve as another example, but it's probably best to use Andrew Carnegie and the Carnegie Steel Company not only as an example of a monopoly, but also as an example of one of the two ways you can create a monopoly, which is through vertical integration. The other example is useful because not only is it another example of monopoly, but it's also another example, or an example of the other method of creating a monopoly, which is called horizontal combination. So our example here is John D. Rockefeller, who was in the oil industry, which the visual aid here is perfect for that. He used horizontal combination for his company, the Standard Oil Company. And horizontal combination is when one company gains control over other companies that produce the same product. And essentially what John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company did was they bought up every oil refinery they possibly could. And that led them to be able to control the industry. So both Carnegie and Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan too, they used monopolies to control an industry and become essentially the only business that was offering a particular service. And that meant that they could charge whatever they wanted for it and that they could crowd out competition. It was very good for their profit margins and their wealth, but it was also arguably very bad for smaller businesses and definitely bad for the consumer who had no alternatives to these companies. And Morgan, Carnegie, and Rockefeller are either called captains of industry or robber barons, depending on the attitude of the person using the title. Captains of industry is obviously a positive title used for them, whereas robber barons implies a more pejorative term for these very wealthy individuals who ran these massive businesses that were essentially created using monopolistic practices. While Carnegie and Rockefeller represent the ultra-rich, it's also important to note that the industrial working class were incredibly economically insecure. So these are working class people who operated these factories in the burgeoning industrial economy. Machines had gradually replaced skilled artisans, meaning that work had become increasingly unskilled, or to do a job, you increasingly didn't have to have special skills or training or education or anything like that. Members of the industrial working class in the U.S. faced long hours, sometimes like 60 hours a week, very low wages, and they didn't have what we would consider to be a social safety net. So they didn't have pensions for when they retired. They didn't get any injury compensation if they were hurt on the job. They had no unemployment insurance offered by the government if they were out of work and looking for a job. They also faced typically very unsafe working conditions, and employers were usually openly hostile to unions or workers' organizations that tried to fight for more rights for their workers. If you went on strike, as unions often did, strikers oftentimes found themselves fired and replaced by what were called scabs, or replacement workers that would come in to help break a strike and do that job. This era also saw a much greater use of child labor because this was not yet illegal, and working class children could find themselves working in a factory setting doing particular jobs from very, very young ages in order to contribute to their family income. Generally, like I say, the working class were economically insecure. Steady employment was rare due to that cycle of economic boom and bust that we've seen really since Andrew Jackson. So since the early 1800s, we've seen that the economy will grow in the United States very rapidly, and then it will sort of self-correct in a panic or a short depression. And that meant that, again, steady employment for the working class could be rare because they might work for a factory for a time before a bust in the economy, and then through a panic or a depression they may find themselves out of work because their factory is closed. And it should be clear that there was a dramatic gap between the rich and the poor in this era. And the wealthy tended to engage in something called conspicious consumption. And conspicious consumption was a term coined by Thorstein Veblen in his work The Theory of the Leisure Class, which he published in 1899. And it refers to someone spending money in order to demonstrate the possession of their wealth. So very large houses, lavish dinner parties, ostentatious clothing, that type of thing. So if you think of the wealthy practicing conspicious consumption or spending lots of money just to show how much they have, you can compare this to photographs in Jacob Riis's book, How the Other Half Lives, which he published in 1890. And Jacob Riis's work, How the Other Half Lives, published photographs of the poor in crowded tenement conditions, or homeless children sleeping on the street, or the unsafe factory conditions that many people found themselves in. Now, Riis is someone that we'll talk about again, just in the context of How the Other Half Lives. because Reese is considered something called a muckraker. And a muckraker is someone who dug up, muck. The idea is that they're a journalist who exposed social injustices like poverty or bad working conditions. Muckraking journalism will become, muckraking journalism will become very popular at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century during what's called the Progressive Era. And that'll be part of Period 7, so we'll talk about that later. But Jacob Riis's name might be one to remember because it'll come up again, and he's a useful example to be able to use.